Today I've come to the University of Glasgow to speak to Professor Raymond Boyle, author of Power Play, lecturer, and a lover of all things football. To begin with, Raymond told me about the media representation of football fans in Scotland.
It may depend on what part of the media you're talking about. So, if it's broadcasters, then quite often television will see fans, frankly, as the backdrop onto which the game is projected. You know, it's playing football in empty stadia is not doesn't look good televisually. So, television, certain parts of television want fans to be there. They want fans to be engaging. They don't necessarily listen to fans. They don't necessarily that interested in them. I think for newspapers, sometimes they see fans as important because they want them to buy their newspapers. At other times, they've looked at fans in quite disparaging ways. I mean, we forget for years and years, football treated fans absolutely terribly, and clubs treated them with disdain almost. So the idea that that they've always valued fans and I think we need to be quite clear about that. That it depends on what part of the media you're in. It depends how you're funded. It depends the value they have to you. So I think it's quite a complicated picture overall.
Ultra groups in Scotland are on the rise, but where have they come from and why are they becoming more common?
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, again, 10, 15 years ago, there was nothing. If you just said ultras in the footballing context in the UK, it wasn't. Ultras was something that was connected, particularly with Italy. Mm-hmm. But it's become a kind of a label that's been put. I mean, it's interesting because it's a label that the fans themselves have picked up on, so it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling way of differentiating you out. I think in part it's also a reaction against the kind of broader shifts in the game, where people feel that they're increasingly priced out of it. They feel increasingly you have a commercial media driven product, inverted commas, product, not a game. I think it's a generational thing. I think it's not exclusively, but it is kind of younger, not exclusively men, but you go back through the history of football, there's always been that group that's been the kind of that's been the kind of core element of the sport. Often clubs are happy to have them, but they always are slightly nervous about them because they never can quite control them. Groups of young men traditionally have often been, potentially problematic. So I think the ultra thing is an example of, for me, it's an example of a more connected media environment for fans, where they know much more about what's going on in other countries. They're much more in touch with that. It's also a way of differentiating themselves out from other types of fans. And of course, it also offers them avenues for excitement and interest and expressing their passion in kind of new and different ways from, say, traditionally. I don't necessarily, associate it with the violent side of things. Certainly in the Scottish context, I know some people, they have that, it has that connotation. I'm sort of less worried about that side of it. I just think it's part of that evolution that every new generation of fans coming in finds a new way of kind of expressing themselves.
Raymond explained why ultraculture is not as loved in Scotland as it is on the continent, and particularly in Germany.
Well, I think it's more rooted in Germany. It's got a longer kind of history, but I think the infrastructure of the game is slightly different as well. It's cheaper. It's still much more likely to be a working class sport than or spectator sport to some extent. Although the Scottish game is different. I mean, Scotland is different than England. In many ways, the game in Scotland is much more unreconstructed in one sense. It's much more like the kind of fan base would have been 15, 20 years ago than if you went to, say, England, for example, just because of the economics of it. But I think you can't take that cultural side out of it. And what happens as well is that each generation lays down its own narratives and its own stories. That's one of the appeals of football. The appeal of supporting a football club is not that you're here today, gone tomorrow. It's that you're part of something that stretches back, that connects you with different previous times. And I think the longer that narrative story gets, the more powerful it can be. So if groups have been organising in particular ways for many years in, say, somewhere like Germany or whatever, then it's only natural that will become almost more deeply ingrained in the game. Whereas something that's seen as slightly newer can sometimes initially be viewed with suspicion. and can take kind of longer to do that. So I think there's a combination of factors that it looks like the same game played on the same pitch, but actually, if you go to Germany, you go to Norway, you go to Switzerland, wherever you will go, the broader cultural histories that the fans bring to the game will mean that those things play out slightly differently.
I believe that the cultural differences Raymond mentions are clear. The main problems for ultra groups in Scotland appear to be heavy policing and stewarding, whilst the media are of little help. The positive for hardcore football fans is that ultra groups are on the rise in any case.